Hello, dear friends, whoever may be watching this somewhere on the internet at a point in time unknown to us. Today, I'm really excited to share with you all a really exciting mechanism to conserve large landscapes at scale, principally by the creation of new permanent protected areas. This was a mechanism that I hadn't heard of before I met our dear friend who's also here on the call, Haley Mellon. But very briefly, for those who don't know me, I am Alexa Firmenich. I am an investor, a philanthropist in this space in supporting nature, as well as running a biodiversity project at ETH University that's creating the world's most comprehensive measure of biodiversity for any pixel on the planet. So I swim in love, and I'm here in dedication to nature. I'm going to now hand over to my dear friend, Haley Mellon, to introduce herself.
Hello, all. Thank you so much for listening today. My name's Haley Mellon, and I had the acute pleasure of getting to meet Alexa a couple of years ago now. And we've been in deep conversation, both in person and remotely, on land conservation since. I'm an artist and land conservationist and support the creation of new permanent protected areas on behalf of individuals like Alexa, potentially yourselves, and the cultural community. So that would be artists, museums, and such. I founded Art into Acres, which is a nonprofit 501c3 based in the United States that works in matching foundation funds to fund, but also to provide diligence and research on the creation of new international protected areas.
And so let me give you guys a little lay of the land of where we're going to be today. I had so much fun making this presentation, by the way. For people who know me, they'll see all the little dots and find that maybe entertaining. So what we're going to cover today is, first of all, why this approach is so cool. And just briefly, for me to share something there, this was such a specific form of conservation that even though I'd been working in the space for quite a few years, I'd never heard of it before. A dear friend introduced Haley and I. And as Haley explained to me how this process worked, and it's such a trialed and tested and proven method of conservation that I was quite surprised I hadn't heard of it. But as it turns out, and as we'll hear today, only a few global funders actually are involved in this. So groups like VEAS and Bezos Earth Fund and Rewild and Tompkins Foundations. But as we'll see a little bit later, it's a very exciting way of leveraging grants and funds from other actors to protect millions of acres of land. So today we'll speak about why this approach is so cool. I touched on it a little bit now, and why everyone on Earth should really care about land conservation at scale, both philosophically, but also very practically. Haley will speak very briefly about the genesis of Art to Acres, but then we're going to get into stuff that you guys will probably find very interesting, like strategy. How does this actually work? What are some case studies? We have really, really interesting case studies. And I will just share with you guys my portfolio of landscapes that I've helped to protect, and some of the sort of financial mechanisms behind that, and a very quick part at the end on how you can get involved. So before we get into the nitty gritty, I kind of see this approach, the way I understand it, as nature's hidden ally, because we're permanently protecting critical biodiversity. This is an image from Cape Froward. This is the southern tip of Chile, right at the end of the world. And we'll be speaking about that a little bit later. But essentially, what you'll learn is, what we'll speak about today, is why this is very under the radar. It's surprisingly affordable. I was actually very surprised when Haley first kind of spoke to me about how this worked. I was like, oh, wow, how did I not know this? And yet it's underfunded, and it's scalable, and it's been de-risked. It's obviously very much directed by the local communities. And it's a way, I think, for when you go to sleep at night, or I'll speak to myself when I go to sleep at night, feeling like I use my financial capital in some way to create a legacy for nature. And I think, if there are any investors listening to this, like that criteria at the bottom for me is always a really interesting reason to get involved in anything. So something about Haley is that she's incredibly shy. I had to sort of strong arm her into doing this presentation, but she's being very gracious. So this slide probably makes her feel very awkward, and we won't spend a long time. But I do think it is important to know the genesis of how a particular project or idea begins, even though Haley is working in a field that has been around for a long time. So Haley, my dear, if you may, could you share just briefly, as an artist, how you understood that there was this latent potential, especially harnessing the cultural community and getting them involved in conservation, and a very brief outline of Art to Acres and where it started and where it is today?
Gladly, Alexa. And it's such a treat to get to do this with you. I think there's a longer history in this notion of taking care, like the term to curate an exhibition comes from the base of to care for. And so, especially in the Eastern traditions, there's a long history in caring for places. And that could be something that is uniquely human. Possibly animals care for heritage sites, but we're just not. Hopefully, soon when we speak animal, we'll find that out. But at present, we don't yet know. I think there's a history in philanthropy, art, and land conservation. And you see that in the legacy of certain families, like the co-founders of MoMA in New York, also gifted the Grand Tetons and sort of foresight that the Grand Tetons should be conserved, and gifted that landscape to the U.S. government. You have the Tompkins work in Chile and Argentina, which has such an exceptional legacy. And they, in part, funded that through the sale of an art collection. As a young artist and someone not of means, I would often volunteer on the weekends with my father. And I noticed that he made volunteering a huge part of our life. And I wanted to live a life of service. And when you're a young artist, you study from paintings of people who are no longer here. And you're reading great philosophic texts of writers who are no longer with us. So I was quite interested in the third principle, in the sense of legacy, of what we do now and how we leave it behind for future generations to study, reflect on, and think from. And so the notion of an artwork as being a human-made space, connecting that with large-scale land conservation, which in a way is a non-human space, but both things are of artifact, one being a moment in time and one being the visual of all time compounded, was really interesting to me as a creative person and as someone who wanted to effort now so that, living things could continue to evolve and reproduce and have good lives. So that was the formation of Art to Acres. We work very quietly. The advisors and 2 donors pay for all overhead costs of the organization. So any philanthropic funds at 100% are restricted to the land conservation of donors' direction. And we have now, as of this last week, committed to the support of 76 million acres, or I guess that would be about 30 million hectares of new permanent protected areas.
That is so deeply inspiring. Yeah, I remember one of our first meetings, we were kind of reminiscing on, well, not reminiscing, but talking about the strangeness that with, an inch of an easel of paint, you can help to protect, such vast landscapes. It's a very interesting way of thinking about things. And many people that I meet in the art community want to get involved and want to, contribute to this moment in time biodiversity crisis. And this seems like
and artists really are like to give and like to give things out. And so one of the things that we do in depth is we match them with foundations or individuals who would like to support large-scale land conservation, so that the funds can multiply and be leveraged, and in community can go forward to support new permanent projects. And the grant making happens in tandem. And that's something we did with Alexa's foundation.
Yeah. Thank you, my dear. So, Haley, I will now hand over the clicking actions to you, and maybe, just run us through the mechanisms, approaches, and conditions.
Okay, great. So permanent protected area is something we're going to refer to a lot today. It's called a PPA. So you'll hear that in short. It's essentially an area that cannot be degazetted, or that will be permanently protected. And permanence is such a rare thing, right? We're always moving, changing what we're doing. But there's few things in life that we do now for longevity. I think making paintings is one, texts, inventions, education, having children. A PPA is often an indigenous conserved area, a national park, a regional park. It is a different terminology based on country. So with large-scale land conservation, you always begin with the history of the country and their relationship to the land. and you follow the tenure of the land and country. Like some countries in like Suriname, there's not private land ownership. Some countries like Guatemala, there is. And so you follow like the tenure, and then you look at best approaches per country. Ecosystem conservation is something that is quite important for large-scale land conservation. So you'll want to look at what is the natural flow of an entire watershed. And so one of the things that we try to focus on is what's called IFLs, intact forest landscapes. So it'll be something that's large enough that reproduction can help it happen at a very healthy level, ongoing. So that tends to be about 60,000, maybe 40 to 60,000 hectares or larger. And that would often conserve a full ecosystem or more. And with that sort of scale, you get clean water, you get a sense of support for the full track of biodiversity. So you look at migration patterns, and you're making sure that you're not sort of making these isolated islands, so to speak, but instead you're continuing to add to the conservation community by connecting up other conserved areas. So land conservation really matters for not only for the species that live on the locations, but also drifting out to the species that live around the locations, including human settlements, for the clean water and the clean air aspects, but also for refugia. So sometimes, as the planet is getting warmer, species are going to be moving, and they need to be able to have other spaces to move into. So the size of the land conservation is something that's important that is large scale. And it's a very proactive and concrete action you can do, because you can do a grant once and fund the creation of a new permanent protected area. And you did that, and that the maps are made, the lines are drawn, so to speak. And it is a very incredible and impactful legacy also for one's family, for one's kids to learn from.
And I think we'll get to that in a second. But inside of the funds that are given to create the permanent protected area is also how we can ensure its permanence. And then I know you're going to get to that a bit later in the presentation, but in my mind, like the first time Haley told me this, I had a little skeptical voice that was like, but then, people could come in or whatever. And inside of that funding are already all of the guardrails around what permanence means. Actually, maybe I'll speak to these next slides, because I get very passionate about the climate change stuff. And I think we decided I'd do that anyway. Obviously today we're hearing about climate change, carbon in the atmosphere, etc. Natural climate solutions are one of the top 5 ways, but also help to create a kind of planet that we want to live in. And so these last wild places are sort of the last remaining bastions that are generating all of the processes that allow the rest of the landscapes to survive and to live, whether that's hydrology or carbon flows or nutrient flows or cycles. We rely on nature and on biodiversity to create the climate, to regulate the climate, and to offset a lot of human emissions. And so even though we don't need always rational reasons to do this, I think it's important to know about those. And also just the mystery, like we don't know so many species that exist on this planet, and they're already going extinct. And I was thinking about this today. It's like the universe has created these incredible expressions of life, whether it's a type of butterfly or a type of monkey. And these invisible deaths is the death of something that will never happen again in the universe. We're not talking about so much land. It's a small percentage of land, as you can see, that harbors the majority of these threatened species. And again, going back to the cost piece, we're looking at 20 cents possibly for some of these lands of permanent protected areas per acre. I mean, think about the calculation of what you spend 20 cents on a day-to-day basis. Yet, such a small percentage of these lands are protected. This is 15% behind us here. And as I alluded to earlier, the amount of carbon sequestration, the amount of ecosystem services, so that's pollination for all of our food, that's water retention, capture, flood mitigation, and not to mention the amount of human communities would depend on, in this case, coral reefs, but also all types of natural ecosystems to keep surviving. The last slide, just on this point, we have this shifting baseline syndrome where we don't see what we've lost until it's really gone. And we've lost 60% of all of this wildlife and most of the big ocean fish. And so if we think about it, we're kind of plucking out these streams of life and the whole tapestry is unweaving. And therefore, these permanent protected areas, these landscapes, are some of the last places where our multi-species, other species can actually be and survive. And we rely on them very, very much so for our own survival. All right, Haley, do you want to describe a little bit about the way that the process actually works? I find this fascinating because, it's like you have a landscape. What the hell do you need to do for it to come under protection?
Absolutely. So as Alexa was saying, security ends up being exceptionally important. That's like 98% of my job. Because in order to make something have the support necessary for it to be permanent, you focus on diligence and process and slowness. So slowness actually comes into place as well. Like actually slowing down helps the process. We've never worked on a project that didn't succeed. So that I feel quite good at the notion of the possibility of this at scale. A common timeline begins with about somewhere between 10 and 30 years of prior community request. And that would be local communities, people who've seen ecological disasters in other communities, people who want to protect their watershed. It could be scientist focused, but usually there's 10 to 30 years of research. And that could be something that's very more nimble and grassroots. It could be something like the Chicago Field Museum coming in and doing a biodiversity survey. And a lot of it has to do with mapping. So looking at parameters, because you want to get a sense as to why you're going to protect where you're going to protect. It's very important that the local leadership directs this, and that we can then inherit this history of interest. There's not that many organizations or people that fund large-scale land conservation. So the projects that are possible are very well known, and they're talked about in length and watched for quite a while. Then there's about usually a 1.5 to 2 year diligence process, where from a grant making end, you look at the tenure of the landscape. You go and you actually meet the people who are either selling the land or who live near the land. In general, 55% of our surface, believe it or not, we can't even reach by human powered vehicle. So a lot of the planet is actually quite remote and not accessible to us, and a lot of land conservation happens there. So maybe no one's living on the landscape, or maybe there'll be 250 families for 2 million acres or 800,000 hectares. But the diligence process just involves the particularities, and no two diligence processes are the same. And usually the matching funds foundations will be having the same diligence teams moving forward. And so this is a really interesting sort of creative process. Once there's a decision to move forward with grants and matching funds, there's about a 3-month granting process where you go through all the paperwork, and then the actual funding process unfolds. And then at that point in time, reviews start happening. There's community meetings. There's periodic quarterly reports. And this becomes quite interesting because there's international communication with on-the-ground teams. And you really hear how it's going and where there might be pauses, where there might be moments that things are speeding up. In particular, there's a recent project that is Afro-Colombian in Colombia, and the local indigenous communities that are a different heritage than the Afro-Colombia communities wanted to join the project. So now the project's getting larger, but it's going to slow down for that reason. After that point, once the legal process is done, the map working is done, the biodiversity surveys are done, community meetings are completed, the sort of signage and naming and the sort of various national and local government processes are done, the actual areas is announced and it's created. Maps are changed, and suddenly you have a new permanent conserved area. So in the last 12 months, Art & Diggers has to date supported 35 million new acres. And the PPA cost in the last 12 months was about 80 cents per hectare. And these are a range of indigenous conserved areas and national parks. And this is like such a fascinating question. How is it permanent? And I want to just speak a little bit about the different modes of creating permanence. Now, one of the great things about large scale land conservation is often it's the surface and it's subterranean. So you have all of the minerals, metals, gas, oil, and all of that is conserved as well. So it's essentially like a stacked situation. There's a lot of value in that. There's exceptional value. And so how it can become permanent becomes a focus. First of all, there's titling. So saying, okay, this is a national park. Second of all, there's an approach where oftentimes there's a component of land purchase or land trust. So it can be like what we finished support of 2 weeks ago, Montecasias National Park in Colombia. It was 26 parcels of land purchase donated to the country of Colombia. And then on top of that, they created a layer, which is a national park. Another approach to layer is a commitment of management funding. So this can be usually countries within the EU, also Canada, some from the United States. And there's different sort of management funding modalities that also commit by taking the money that it has to be a permanent conserved area. So there's a very strong legal precedent on that action. And I think that goes to speak to where management funding comes from. Oftentimes it's management for conserved areas that are quite remote. That's not a very expensive annual cost because they have a natural geographic fortress, which is why they still exist as being conserved. But there's some ranger fees. There are supports for research stations. And by putting a research station in an area, that also adds a leverage to the security, both of the location, but also of the long-term conservation interest from global factions. The philanthropic commitment is a huge part of the permanence security because by making the philanthropic commitment, you're doing so in contract saying that it needs to be a permanent conserved area. There's also national and international rules. There's national conservation designations, and these are very strictly followed. Funding is removed from countries once they, at any stage, deny or degazette a conserved area. So it is not just sort of a gray area. It's like black and white. Carbon funding has come in as actually being quite helpful as yet another layer if you're stacking, like creating an onion of security measures where any one security measure is considered robust. But if you then stack 7, it's quite strong. And carbon funding happens when you actually take the carbon off the landscape and you re-endow the landscape with the revenue from a permanent carbon project. And then there's local and national laws, community regulations, and taxes. And so really what we keep on seeing is language, is actually the word of law becomes quite important from an international, national, and community perspective when it comes to security. Some of the areas, again, are private title. Some of them are public lands, but either way, you can determine an approach to permanence that is secure despite tenure type. So this is quite a joy. We get to look at 3 recent portfolio examples. First, we have Saramay, Guatemala. This is a beautiful melanistic puma. I included this example because it is a traditional land conservation. This is the purchase, in this case, co-purchase of a number of different parcels that have both particular title, but they also have an indigenous history. And so one of the approaches here was to not actually purchase the land, but to become co-ownership, where conservation is co-ownership with communities that have maybe 200 people on title for a parcel. And then the entire landscape will have a national protection, but the indigenous people still own their land. They have payment for 50% that's held by not by an NGO, but by a civilian association of which they have members on the board. So it's a very interesting thing where you have private land ownership. However, it is kept in the history of collectivity, which most parcels historically have been. And then I think there's a couple pictures here that show the forest. So this was the last unconserved cloud forest in northern Central America. Began the project in 2017. It is a longer project, and it is 30 to 45,000 acres. We'll see how big it is by the time we get done, of cloud forest at about 1,000 to 2,000 meters. It is a limestone mountain with 5,000 vertical caves, very dangerous to walk on. And cloud forest is our wettest forest in the world. It gets like 2 inches of rain a day. It's beautiful inside. It has an exceptional history of study. It was very helpful to have this research studies. It has about 720 resident bird species, avian species. Here you have an exceptional red. This is home of the resplendent quetzal.
And the quetzal bird that, like the Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, is based off.
Oh, really? That's great.
So yeah, look at that little guy. He's so
nice. Like happy up there. I don't know. I did 2 site visits last year. I did not see any quetzals, but I did hear a lot of spider monkeys. I think we're going to have a video of one of our primate friends. Here we go. So it has a pretty intense canopy. Great project. This is an example, though, of permanent land conservation in land trust with national designation and patience.
And patience, very well said.
San Juan, Colombia. This is an example of indigenous and Afro-Colombian landscape. It is around 250,000 hectares. You have mangroves, ocean, and delta. And this is a great picture as to how the conservation follows the natural topography of the landscape. This is the project I was speaking to that's going to now expand because there's indigenous communities that really would like to join the project. And here's a sense of town meetings. So again, locally led, conversation-based process. Now in Colombia, they have FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent, which means that the people who live on the landscape not only need to designate and request the conservation, but they need to also approve it. So it's a slow process. It's a really elegant process. We just recently began funding a project in Honduras, which is going to have for the first time their FPIC included in their process. So it's sort of a change in modality. So ground up.
I mean, it probably goes up saying, I would imagine, Haley, that getting the community to be part of this makes them so much more involved and proud of the project themselves, right? It kind of gives a sense of involvement and ownership, which when you speak about permanence, I think that's another important aspect.
It's so true. It's like what we're closest to, we can most have empathy for. And so if people don't want to have the landscape around them conserved, you don't even begin the project. And also what's really cool is livelihood. Like livelihoods have been changing, wherein people who used to hunt something are now showing researchers that are tracking it. So it's quite exciting to see what happens when we value nature as the true like home that we live on and we live with. So here's an example of some of the coastal mangrove forests, huge area. I mean, just massive.
I can't even imagine. This is so gorgeous. And mangroves, I remember reading that mangrove forests capture, what is it, like an astounding more amount of carbon than even like other types of forests. It's just, they are like ecological sinks of carbon. Who's this little guy?
That's my buddy. That's my buddy. It's the only in focus amphibian picture that I probably have.
Absolutely. And so I think this is the last case study that you have for us right now. This is Canada.
This is a fantastic project that was brought forward to me from the Weiss Foundation. It is a national migration corridor going between Canada and the United States for a population of caribou. And I think what's nice about this is what you're funding in particular, since you're not funding the land because it's not its owned, I mean, it's common land of the Northern Yukon people, is you're funding what they requested, which is an endowment for management. So that's actually quite rare to create a new protected area. And in doing so, the Northern Inuit, Yukon Inuit Congress is voting the protected area in with the Congress of Canada. And that endowment will go to fund rangers, researchers, and essentially just jobs for the local people to be able to support this area, which doesn't have any inhabitants on it. So it's a really exciting project. It's still pretty much under wraps. Fingers crossed that it gets approved in the next 6 months, but it's been a pleasure to learn about. And there's such a dedicated team working on this very, very complicated location.
Yeah, what a huge expanse. And as you said, it's a migration corridor, right? So if these species don't get the space to move, they slowly inbreed and die out.
They've had a 40% decline of their numbers in 2 years.
Wow.
Yep.
That's dramatic. My portfolio, it feels weird to say my portfolio because these are, massive natural landscapes. But I think also for people listening, it's like, okay, well, how could this look for me? Haley and I worked together for a few months to hone in, I think, on certain projects or geographies that would feel really aligned. It was very clear for me this would be in Latin America. It's where I've lived for a long time, and I just love that geography very deeply. So I did want it to be personal in a sense, and luckily, Latin America does have absolutely critical ecosystems to protect. And we selected different projects according to also learnings, because I want to learn. I want to learn, how different projects come together, how the financing mechanisms work. And so these were selected for their variety and obviously for their impact. The first one on the left is in Chile. This is Cape Farrow National Park. This is in partnership with Tompkins Conservation. This is in the most southern reaches of Chile. And it's a point of convergence of 3 oceans that generate this incredible explosion of wildlife. So you have krill and whales, and you just have like this sort of feeding ground for so many marine species. You've also got critical peatlands in there, which are lands that are also very, very carbon rich. It's the last habitat for several species, not to mention the last habitat for human culture. So you have a 7,000-year-old plus human culture that's present. And I think Haley's alluded to this as well in our conversation, which is this is also about human livelihoods and those who do not feel different from their ecosystem. So specifically, my grant here helped to fund the declaration of a new national park. It leverages public lands, pays for legal processes, administration, community management plans, etc. And it's being matched by art 100% at 100%, and by Tompkins Conservation at 200%. And the total predicted scale of this is about 835,000 acres. The next one is in Peru. This is right on the border with Colombia. This is like thick Amazon. And I wanted to choose this picture because when I saw this in the diligence documents, I couldn't believe how beautiful it was, because each of these, all that blue is tributaries. That's just water. And obviously when you say like, oh, the Amazon, the jungle is the lungs of the planet. Like, doesn't this look like an X-ray of your lungs? Or, it's just the way that, and as you can imagine, water is very fluid and mobile. And so if roads start coming in and pollution, then, from one stream, it contaminates the whole ecosystem. And so this is a high biodiversity wilderness area. It covers 3 key rivers, and it actually creates a binational conservation area, so between Peru and Colombia. And it is being threatened by extractive activities, as you might imagine, like oil and mining and logging and road building. And part of this grant also included titling, of which Haley spoke about. Interestingly, I didn't know this also before, but freshwater conservation funding is probably the least funded type of conservation, which is crazy. So also I wanted to contribute to that. And finally, this reserve in Bolivia, this is the expansion of a natural reserve, and it's connected to other permanent protected areas. So this is sort of a connectivity play. What I think was very interesting in this was that they designed a local water fund, a local municipal water fund with the government to support the ongoing management of the project. And because you're protecting the watershed, you're allowing all the communities within that region and downstream to benefit from having cleaner water, including a big agricultural center of the state. So you can see how each of these is a bit different, but each very strategic in its own way. Next, Haley, maybe you can speak to a little bit briefly about how this leveraged funding happens.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that excites me most is actually how impactful the commitment of private philanthropic funds is to the entire ecosystem of the creation of a new permanent protected area. Usually, like if you come in and you bring $1, Art to Acres will match with a series of other foundations like the Weiss Foundation or Bezos and say like, hey, we'll come in with $1. Would you come in with $1? And then usually there's 100% to, in some cases, 300% matching funds, as Alexa mentioned in her portfolio. And then you'll come, so like $1 will become $2 or will become $4. And then the nonprofits will historically, they won't be able to actually fund the project. They'll be able to fund all the support for the project. So they will pay for their legal, their auditing, travel, administration, and oftentimes quite a lot of research. And so they'll bring in, quote unquote, another dollar. And then the government add-in will be often quite significant. So either it will be in the case of designation, where you're just designating an area as permanently conserved, but it was previously public and could have been drilled on or mined or sold in terms of its forest reserves. That land will be donated. And so that is an exceptional value. And then at times, like there will be a corporate donation. So in some cases, that'll be the removal of oil leases that were pending, that were purchased but never used. Other times, there will be a very beneficial corporation coming in, like Patagonia, making donations. And so in general, usually you go from 1 to 10, like 1 to 10 is usually the action. A new permanent protected area that just was designated 2 weeks ago, the president said that had we not come in with a philanthropic commitment, they would have dropped it. Because they went through, you go through different administrations and people often don't want to work on the last administration's project. So having that international capital commitment is very attractive and it can just leverage quite a lot. It's very exciting because in that particular case, it was a 1 to 15. There's no way we wanted to pay for the full cost of the project, but we could put in the first dollar commitment.
That's super compelling. And I think for any corporations listening, it's also a great way to actually show commitment to your nature targets or whatever internal policies you may have around ESG. We are not going to go into the kinds of projects that other people get involved with right now, because I think that it's, we're trying to keep this as a shorter presentation. But there are a range of projects that are incredibly de-risked, which means that some of the world's largest foundations and philanthropies have looked at them. They're ready to go. The organizations on the ground have been doing this for a long time. And I will stress that when these lands are gone to development or whatever other pressures are present, we don't get them back. And so we have this thin window or bottleneck to get life through while we figure out our economic and political systems. And so, yeah, I would just encourage anyone who's listening and interested to learn more in a geography that you care about will be an opportunity to support. You get to partner with amazing other philanthropists or donors. I really, really appreciated the community. And the opportunity cost, I think, is just quite high of not doing things like this for all life on Earth. So here's a table. If you're watching this as a video, you can pause and skim it, but I'm not going to speak to it now. I am just going to say a massive thank you for listening to this, wherever you are, whoever you may be. And thank you, obviously, also to Haley for allowing us to do this incredible work and for me to just step in and be like, yeah, thank you for having done all of this so I can feel that I'm contributing to life on this planet. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Yes.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Alexa, for making this possible, making this happen, initiating it, and teaching me so much in the process.